All right, welcome everyone. I want to do a live video addressing Mark Driscoll and Mars Hill. Obviously, a lot has been said about Mark Driscoll and about the rise and fall of Mars Hill over the last, I can't even remember. I think it was 2014, 15, something like that. So it's been about 7 years or so since Mars Hill officially collapsed. The empire of Mars Hill multi-campus ministry, which I would strongly disagree with for multiple reasons, and I'll get into that in a moment. But a lot has been done on Mark Driscoll, but I think that one key component has been missed again and again and again. Probably the most recent notable expose on this particular subject of Mark Driscoll and the rise and fall of Mars Hill is, in fact, the Christianity Today podcast series called The Rise and Fall of Mars Hill. And I've spoken about that a little bit. I gave some of my commentary on what I think about Christianity Today and what I think about their expose on Mars Hill and Mark Driscoll. For those of you who maybe haven't heard me speak to the Christianity Today, their podcast on this subject, I'll give you the nutshell version. I think that it was lousy. I think it was very well produced. So I think it was inspiring to Christian podcasters everywhere, myself included. I think that there's something to be said for not just recording, but really having high production value in podcasts, not just a documentary or something that it has a visual format, but even in an audio format of a podcast, having high production. I thought that was really good. I think there's a lot to learn from that. But in terms of their actual message and content, I'll just say this. Some of the things I agreed with, the big and fast model of church planting, the multi-campus model, those kinds of things, they got into that a little bit, but not much. But the big thing that I disagreed with was they emphasized, in one episode especially, but really throughout the whole theme of all the episodes, they emphasized this idea that one of the big components, leading towards the downfall of Mark Driscoll and Mars Hill was his extreme views on men and women. And I'll just say, I don't really want to hear commentary from raging pagan feminists, aka Russell Moore, Christianity Today. I don't want to hear a pagan feminist commentary on a guy's view of men and women. I'm just not interested in that. And yes, I did use the word pagan. I think that Christianity Today, another word for that would be apostates today. I'm much more interested in Christianity yesterday than I am Christianity today. Not because I'm not hopeful, not because I think things are going to progressively get worse and worse and worse for the landscape of Christianity until Christ returns. I am post-millennial. I am optimistic in my eschatology, but I do think that along this general trend upwards, I do believe that there are dips and spikes along the way, and I do believe that we've been in a dip for a while now, especially here in the church in America. And I think that Christianity Today represents that dip and in a major way. I think that they are soft on biblical theology, and especially soft on the issue of roles between men and women, and not just roles, but design, right? We got to remember Genesis. It doesn't say male and female roles. God assigned them, but male and female, God made them. So it's not male and female roles God assigned them, but male and female natures God designed them, we might say. And that's true because it rhymes, and everything that rhymes from a preacher, therefore must be theologically accurate. I'm being facetious, but I think that it holds, right? It's not, we think of like a bird and a fish, right? And we would think that God arbitrarily assigns the role, the responsibility, the purpose of flight to a bird, and that God arbitrarily assigns the role, the purpose of swimming to the fish, as though these roles have nothing to do with the makeup, the design of a bird and a fish, right? Like, don't we think for a second that there might be something to do with the fact that God calls birds to fly, but he also created them with hollow bone structures and feathers and wings, right? And he calls fish to swim, but he also created and designed their nature with fins and gills and scales. I think that has something to do with it. If we're not careful, what we do with the roles of men and women is we ultimately we levy a subtle, perhaps even subconscious accusation against God himself, that ultimately says something like this: God's roles for men and women in his created order are arbitrary. God assigns purpose and duty and responsibility arbitrarily. But that's not it. That's not it. I'll say this in regards to preaching. Um, it's not that a woman merely should not preach. And you need to hear this. It's not just that a woman should not preach. A woman cannot preach. She can't. Not just she shouldn't, because that role hasn't been assigned to her, but she shouldn't, and the role has not been assigned to her, because she cannot preach. She doesn't have the design to preach. She doesn't have that makeup. And you might be thinking, well, why? Why can't a woman teach theology? Well, part of the problem is our distinctions between the roles of men and women have eroded for at least two reasons. One, because our understanding, so the distinction of role between women and men has eroded because our understanding of anthropology and the design of men and women has eroded, but also our understanding of the church, our ecclesiology has eroded. And within this erosion of our understanding of the church and the purpose of the church and the nature of the church, we have also begun to thoroughly misunderstand the role and the purpose and all these things of preaching within the church. And when it comes to preaching, there is a very real sense, and it's biblically supported, that preaching is feeding Christ's sheep. There's a nourishing aspect to preaching, right? That we are giving spiritual bread. We are giving Christ, who he himself says, I am the bread of life, right? In John chapter 6, it's not just come and eat your fill of the physical bread that perishes, that's here today and gone tomorrow, and ultimately leaves you wanting more, that leaves you hungry. But I am the spiritual bread, the bread of life. Come to me, feast on me, my flesh, drink my blood, right? This kind of, and all the people that were following Jesus, they leave, and he turns to the disciples and says, do you want to leave also? And they respond by saying, where can we go? You have the words of life. We don't understand precisely what you're saying, but we're going to lean further in to the person and the teachings of Christ rather than running away. And so my point is that preaching is offering people Christ in the word as it is exegeted properly, exposited, interpreted, but then also applied, right? We don't just interpret a text, but we also apply it. I always say that, that preaching is made up of three primary components, right? Three primary components. Number one, we have revelation. Number two, interpretation. Number three, application. Revelation, interpretation, application. Revelation means that when the preacher stands behind the pulpit before the people of God on the Lord's day, he must not say, I have a dream, I have a church growth strategy, I have an idea, I have a program, I have this, I have that. No, he must say, I have a text. Thus saith the Lord. If you don't have a text of Scripture, then go ahead and sit down. Do us all a favor. Save us 45 minutes to an hour and sit down. I don't care to hear what you have to say. So you better have a revelation, and the only true revelation is not the revelation of man, but the revelation of God. It is a text from Scripture. The second key component is interpretation, which is a proper exegesis of that text that says, this is what God means by the text, not relativism that says, here's the text, the revelation from God, and what does it mean to you? And it can mean, 47 different things for 47 different people based off of your subjective reasoning and however you metaphorically. No, there is a proper exegesis, God's meaning, not eisegesis, reading something into the text, but exegesis, reading out of the text the meaning that God himself intends by that particular text. So revelation, I have a text, not I have a dream or an idea or a vision. Then interpretation being God's interpretation, a proper exegesis of the text. And then lastly, application. right? And because we have such an antinomian church, a church today in America that is against the law of God, that has forsaken the historical reformed view of the third use of the law. That right that the law of God is not a path to salvation. No one will be saved by works done as unto the law. We're saved by grace alone, through faith alone, in Christ alone. But upon being saved, the law of God is a lamp unto our feet. It guides us. It functions as a guide, as a compass, as a path. It's the light. It lights the path. And it doesn't light the path to salvation. It lights the path from salvation. So good preaching doesn't just give us a text, revelation. It doesn't just give us an exegesis of the text, interpretation, but then it also gives us something to do. It gives us application. And people always, they cannot help but hear that as legalism, again, because we have such an anti-law, such a antinomian church today. We have a lawless, licentious, antinomian church today. And so, but good preaching gives us something to do. And that's not legalism. It would be legalism if a sermon gave us something to do in order to merit the favor of God. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm not talking about giving us something to do as a path to salvation, but giving us something to do as a path from salvation. Not trying to elicit God's salvation, God's favor, but rather a response of obedience in love for the free grace we've already received by faith alone in Christ alone. All right, so that's preaching. All right, so preaching has revelation, interpretation, application, and it nourishes the sheep of God. But here's the deal: if all preaching does is nourish, it feed, offer people Christ, the bread of life, feed the sheep, then I think that's part of the reason why the church in America has this soft, complementarian, and often egalitarian view, which ultimately stems from our view of anthropology and not just the roles of men and women, but the design of men and women, which is often androgyny, right? We think that men and women have different roles on the outside, but they're really the same on the inside, that there's not a distinction in their design, that there's not a significant distinction in the actual makeup of men and women, right? Male and female, he made them. Not just male and female, he assigned them, right? But male and female, he made them. God made man, that is mankind, humanity, in his image, male and female, he made them. Not just male and female roles he assigned them, but male and female natures he designed them, right? So we can't be androgynous. And I would argue that we can't merely be complementarian, because I think it lends towards androgyny, a difference in roles, but a difference in the assignment of roles that is arbitrary, that doesn't actually stem from a distinction in design, right? Which is ultimately complementarian in theory, but androgynous in actual conviction. No, what I'm arguing for is I think biblical patriarchy. Patriarchy is the word. It's a biblical word. It's the right word. And the fact that it scares people, I think, is even better. Because I think what it does is it functions as a sorting hat, if you will. It helps us to see who is serious about the scripture and who has theological liberalism creeping into their hearts. So all that being said, my point is, the reason why a woman should not preach is because in her makeup, so she should not preach in terms of what she does, her role, but she cannot preach. It's not arbitrary. She cannot preach because of the nature of a woman, her design, and the nature of the church, and specifically the nature of preaching. Preaching is feeding Christ's sheep. And if that's all it is, you might think, well, then why can't a woman do it? Aren't women good at nourishment? Aren't women, don't they seem to excel at feeding and sustaining? I mean, that's what women are doing with a majority of their lives in the role of motherhood, right? They are caring for and encouraging and nourishing children and cooking meals for the family and their husband. And if that's all preaching is simply spiritual nourishment, then why can't a woman do it? But what we need to understand about preaching, right? So not just the makeup of men and women, but also the makeup of the church and the makeup of preaching. The purpose of preaching is it has multiple purposes, and one is to feed, to nourish, but another is to challenge, to exhort, to rebuke, and to call the armies of God, not just feeding the sheep of God, We are the sheep of his pasture, and he feeds us from his hand through preaching. But there are other analogies that the Bible gives us for the church. We are also the army of the living God. We are soldiers in the Lord's army. And so part of what we do in preaching is not just nourish the sheep, but we also call the armies of the living God into battle. And if we view preaching as having that function as well, that purpose as well, charging soldiers to fight to the glory of the king, then all of a sudden we begin to think, well, that's something that not just a woman should not do, but she cannot do. It's not a part of her makeup. It's not a part of her design. That is a uniquely masculine role because it stems from a masculine design, a masculine makeup. And so all that being said, Christianity today is soft. It's feminized. It's secular. It's pagan in many ways, and so they emphasize in the rise and fall of Mars Hill with Driscoll. One of the big reasons why he failed is because he was chauvinistic and too hard on men and women and the distinctions between their roles and those kinds of things. And it's good, that Mark Driscoll really got what was coming to him, because he was being chauvinistic and he was being crude and these kinds of things. And I want to distinguish there and say there are certain things that Mark Driscoll went on record saying. So I'm not talking about hearsay, because hearsay isn't how we render judgments. There needs to be 2 to 3 eyewitnesses, right? We need lines of independent testimony. We need evidence when we're rendering judgments about someone. And so I would say, regardless of the rumors and the hearsay, there are some things that are on paper, things that Driscoll wrote that is hard evidence, right? Not just hearsay, but hard evidence in the ways that he spoke of women particularly, that I would say is definitively inappropriate, definitively crude, and not pleasing to the Lord, demeaning towards women, derogatory. And I think those things were wrong. Now, whether or not those things were frequent enough in their occurrence and crude enough, inappropriate enough in terms of their degree in order to merit a disqualification for eldership, I think there could be a debate there. I think it could be disqualifying. I kind of stand on the line there. It could be disqualifying. It could not be disqualifying. But regardless of whether or not it's disqualifying, I do believe that there are things that Driscoll for sure said, because we have record of it. This isn't hearsay, but there's hard evidence, and that these things are not subjectively could be wrong or inappropriate, but definitively wrong. But Christianity today did a lot more than just that. Christianity today, when you listen to that podcast, The Rise and Fall of Mars Hill, they go beyond just some of his Driscoll's most extreme statements about women, but they go into the theology. Ultimately, what they are indicting is not Mark Driscoll. This is what you need to understand. They are not merely indicting Mars Hill and Mark Driscoll. They are indicting the biblical faithful theology of men and women. They are condemning Christianity. I'll say it like this. Christianity today, in The Rise and Fall of Mars Hill, condemns Christianity. Christianity today is condemning the Christianity of yesterday. And not just yesterday, but I might add the Christian biblical view of men and women that has been held for 2,000 years, all the way up until about 15 minutes ago. So I have some serious problems about that. So all that being said, the things that have been emphasized in terms of why Driscoll failed, why Mars Hill fell apart was, his extreme views on men and women, or also the celebrity mentality. Right? That it was all about one man, These are the kinds of things that have been brought up. But I think there's one dynamic reason for the fall of Mars Hill, and the reason why this ministry did not ultimately succeed, that pretty much everyone seems to have overlooked. I'm not saying it's the exclusive reason, the only reason, but I am saying it is one of the reasons and not an insignificant reason. I think it is one of the reasons, and I think it is one of the primary reasons, one of the key reasons for the failure of Mars Hill that many people have missed. And here it is. You ready? And I'm going to flesh this out, and you need to hear this because I think this is vital. People are not talking about this. It needs to be discussed. I think one of the chief reasons that Mars Hill imploded is because it was in Seattle. Because it was in Seattle. And that sounds incredibly practical. Sounds as though it's not theological, but it is deeply theological, and I'll get into it in just one moment. But I think the context, the geographic location, and I think that this is what I'm going to argue for. I think it's a combination of where Driscoll was trying to do ministry and also what kind of ministry he was trying to have. And when I say what, I'm not talking about the celebrity mentality. I'm not talking about the brand. I'm not talking about the franchise. I'm not talking about the empire. Those things I would disagree with. I think that's bad ecclesiology, and I'll get to that a little bit more here in a moment. But going back to his view of men and women, I think he had the right view. Again, I think he made some statements definitively that were inappropriate. That should not come out of the mouth of an elder, that he worded things at times in a sinful manner that was crude, that was wrong. But his theology, so not always what he said, but what he believed in terms of his theology and what he generally taught on the subject of men and women and their design and the role that is not arbitrary but stems from that design, I think that in general, his view on that subject was theologically accurate. It was biblically faithful. It was the correct view of men and women. But here's the problem. He was teaching this view, and it's not like this was a sideshow. It's not. This was a major component of Mark Driscoll's ministry. This was a major component of the type of community, and I think it should be, but a major component of the type of community and the type of Christian culture that Mark Driscoll and Mars Hill was seeking to establish. A Christian culture that had a robust understanding of the differences between men and women. And that was a major component of the ministry. They were regularly, all right, let me give you some practical examples, regularly encouraging families in Mars Hill for women not to work outside of the home, or at least not for that not to be their primary vocation, that their primary work, it's not that men are called to work and women aren't. Both men and women are called to work. The question is where. A woman is primarily called to work. Titus 2 says this, working at home. Older women should train younger women to love, submit to their husbands, love their children, all these things, not be given to much wine, not be slanderous. But one of the things that Titus 2 says that older women should be training younger women in is training them, admonishing them, encouraging and exhorting them to work, so not to not work, but to work at home. Keepers at home, workers at home. And Driscoll made this a major component of his ministry, and I would say yes and amen, rightly so. And then, on the flip side of the coin, he was regularly encouraging men to work hard outside of the home in terms of protection and provision. Protection and provision, that men are called to be providers, that men are called to quite literally bring home the bacon. And the wife and mother is called, quite literally, to take that bacon and put it in a frying pan and serve it on plates at the dinner table. That may be an overgeneralization, but that is very much a good example of the roles between men and women. A husband is working outside of the home in terms of provision. A woman is working inside of the home in terms of nourishing, right? And this is one of the core pieces, theological pieces, that was undergirding the entire culture of Mars Hill. And here's the problem. Take that and combine it with context. So theology and context. The theology was one income households, not two income, and the kids are in daycare, or you don't have kids, or you procrastinate, you prolong childlessness. But what Driscoll was advocating, think about this. Go back and think about the way he preached and what he modeled and what he encouraged. He was encouraging that households, that people should get married, that they should get married young, that they should start having kids soon, that they should have lots of kids, not just two, right? Not just 1.5 kids, but lots of kids. like 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 kids, that they should not utilize public schools, which they're going to pay for whether they use them or not, in terms of taxes. And I would agree with all these things so far. I do think that people should get married young if they can, but that should be a goal. That they should seek to start having children young. That's Psalm 127 talks about that. It talks about, how children are arrows, right? Children are weaponry. They're not just cute little blessings and the patter of feet on the floor, but they're also weapons. Children are artillery, and we want to have straight arrows and sharp arrows. So we don't want to have lousy arrows that we shoot them and they're so bent they function as a boomerang and come back and hit us in the head. Which often that happens in the Christian world, right? You have kids, but the problem is you send your kids off to Caesar, and then you're shocked when they come back home as Romans, aka you send them to public school. And so, yes, you're producing arrows, but you're actually just producing arrows for the pagans, for the enemy, and they're being used against you. But Psalm 127 says, children are a blessing, and they're not just a blessing, but they're artillery. They are arrows, they're weaponry, and blessed is the man whose quiver is full. Children are good. Lots of children is really good. And Psalm 127 goes further and says that they will sit in the gate with their father. And that's significant. What that means is the gate was, it was like the high court. It was the area in culture, the public square. It was the place where the elders and the leaders and all those who were influential within the city, within the community, would sit and render certain decisions. It's where strategy would be developed. It's where certain judgments would be rendered. And it was also a defensive posture, right? They're sitting in the gates and they're guarding the city. And so Psalm 127 says, children are a blessing. They're arrows. You're exceedingly blessed when your quiver is full. You have a lot of children. And you're also blessed when those children sit with their father. Now, here's the key. For those children to sit with the father, what it's saying is it's the picture of sons specifically that are now grown and qualified to be sitting in positions of authority in the community. They're sitting with their father, not on his knee, bouncing up and down, but they're sitting as grown men who are in positions of leadership, and their father is still sitting in that position too. So it doesn't say that they replaced their father, but they're sitting with their father. And what that implies is that this is a man who had children in his youth, so that when they're fully developed and grown and able to lead, he himself, the father, is still in the fray. He's actually still of fighting age himself, which all that what it insinuates is that he had children, he had lots of children, and he had children in his youth. So all of this is thoroughly biblical. All of it is thoroughly biblical, right? So I fully support Mark Driscoll and those kinds of emphases in his ministry as it pertains to the household, men, women, and children. So he was constantly encouraging people, get married young, start having kids early. Don't just have 1.6 kids, but have several kids. And then with these several kids, which costs money, by the way, children are not burdens, they're blessings, but they're also, as Doug Wilson says, they're not automatic blessings. There are plenty of blessings in this life that are not easy. What makes it a blessing is that it's good. And good and easy are not the same thing. So there are many blessings in this life that are good, but not easy. They're not automatic blessings. They require cultivation. They require responsibility. They require work. And so Driscoll is saying get married young, start having kids young, have several kids young, which is a blessing, but not a burden. It is a blessing, but it is also a responsibility. It is work, and having more kids is more work. And don't utilize public schools. So what does that mean? It means mom can't work. She needs to be home homeschooling the kids, or it means that the kids are in a private Christian school, which costs money, which means you're paying for the public school you don't even use in your taxes. And then you're also paying for this Christian school that is going to cost a lot of money. So when you add all this up, and then he's also saying, and you should faithfully tithe to the church. So you should be generous, not only to your household, but to the household of God. And then, you should also seek to leave an inheritance. Proverbs says a wise man, or a good man, some translations say, a good man leaves an inheritance to his children's children. So not just your children, but enough of an inheritance to bless your children and your grandchildren, which means that a godly Christian man is financially planning for the fiscal well-being of his grandchildren, 2 generations removed. And you might say, well, that's a spiritual inheritance. That just means training. Yeah, it cannot be less than a spiritual inheritance, but I would argue that it is most certainly more. It can't be less than a spiritual inheritance, training up your children in the fear and admonition of the Lord, training up a child in the way they should go. But I think it's also leaving them wealth, not just spiritual wealth, but physical wealth. And so you add all that together, right? I've got to make enough money as a man working outside of the home to where my wife can be a keeper at home, Titus 2, that she can work at home, that I'm not relying on her for supplemental income. And I've got to have children young when I'm young, and I need to have several of them, and I can't send them to public school, which means we're going to have to homeschool them or pay more money to send them to a private Christian school. And I need to be generous in giving to the church. And I need to be storing up an inheritance, not just for my children, but for them and their children, my grandchildren. And you add it all up in dollars and cents. And basically what it amounts to is that you're going to have to make some dough. You're going to have to make some cash. And some of you may be hearing this and say, well, what about Christians in China? What about Christians in North Korea? What about Christians in the first century who were poor? Absolutely. Absolutely. God is gracious. His mercy is new every morning. He sustains his people in the midst of tragedy, in the midst of suffering, in the midst of poverty, all these kinds of things. You can be faithful and poor. But listen to me. There is a difference in somebody who is faithful, right? They're poor despite being faithful, and someone who is failing in their financial obligations of provision, which is a man is called to. There's a difference in someone who is providing less, but he's being faithful. It's not his fault. And then somebody who is providing less and it is his fault. Right, the person who is lazy or the fool. Proverbs speaks of all these things. The sluggard that buries his hand into the dish, but doesn't even have enough discipline to bring it back to his mouth. Or Proverbs also talks about a man who says there is a lion in the street, and so he won't go out of his home. He won't go to work. He won't be productive. He won't cultivate. He won't work because he's always talking about some kind of danger, some kind of threat. There's a lion in the street. We need to stay home. How many people, right? Let's just make this really relevant. How many men who profess to be Christian men used that exact excuse over the last 2 years because of COVID, right? There's a lion in the street. I can't go to work. I'll get mauled by a lion. There's a virus in the street. I can't go to work. I can't step out of my home. I'm going to rely on the government. I'm going to rely on handouts. I'm not going to be productive, right? And I'm talking primarily in this case about young men in their 30s and 40s that the virus posed little to no threat for. That COVID, for the healthy man in his 30s and 40s with young children to provide for, posed just as much threat as the theoretical lion that the sluggard in the book of Proverbs saw, last week. But the likelihood of that lion being in the street again today is like 1 in 10,000, chances, right? That's what the Proverbs is getting. So the Proverbs talk about the sluggard, right? He uses fear as an excuse, but really he's lazy. That's what the Proverbs is getting at. And the Proverbs also speak of the fool. So there's a man who's lazy. There's also a man who's foolish. He makes foolish choices. He makes foolish investments, right? So you can be poor despite being faithful. And in those cases, I'm not speaking to that. In those cases, right, the faithful Christian in North Korea who is poor and it's not their fault. It is rooted in sin, but it's not their sin. It's the sin of an oppressive government that is constantly robbing them, right? That person, God's grace is sufficient. He will get them through, right? That person is off the hook. I'm not indicting that individual as being sinful, but there's a difference in that individual and the person in America who is healthy, and able to work, but is making foolish decisions, right? And there's a whole lot of foolish decisions that can, lazy and foolish, lazy and foolish. There's a lot of ways to be lazy, and there's a lot of ways to be foolish. And one of these things happens to deal with context, location, where you choose to live. So here's Driscoll trying to get people back to biblical traditional roles between men and women, and basically saying, we need to get back to this conservative, biblical, traditional makeup of the household. But we need to do it in Seattle. And here's the rub. Simultaneously, what Driscoll was doing that I believe exasperated both women and especially men. So at first, it's like Driscoll comes on the scene and the church has been so feminized, right? So effeminate. Everything's geared towards women and children, from their gay worship songs, to, Jesus, my boyfriend kind of stuff, to 20-minute TED Talk sermons. A man is not preaching, but rather he's sitting at a table and he's just sharing, and there's all these midweek programs that are all about meeting the felt needs of women and children. Right, that's what Driscoll kind of skyrocketed in. That was the context, this feminized American church. And Driscoll comes and he has something to say to men. But here's the problem. Driscoll was functioning as an elder in the role of a spiritual father. And one of the things that the scripture says to fathers is this: fathers, do not exasperate, particularly not just your children, but your sons. And I believe that one of the reasons why Driscoll ultimately got pushed out of Mars Hill, right? He resigned, but really, that was kind of like you walk into your boss's office, in his case, his plurality of elders, and your boss is going to fire you. And so what you do is before your boss can say, you're fired, you say, you can't fire me, I quit, right? So Driscoll, yes, on record, on paper, he resigned. But really, he was going to be pushed out. And you might say, well, but there was a plan for his restoration. And yeah, but I believe that plan was geared in such a way that he would have slipped out. He would have been put on probation, and having to fulfill this plan and been on a strict probation that he would have slipped. Any man would have slipped, even if he was truly repentant and trying to get his act together. I think that they wanted him gone. The elders wanted him gone. And how do we know that? We know that because of all the dozens of testimonies from people at the church and elders their final word, their final testimony on the matter is, yeah, we didn't like Mark. We wanted him gone, right? So I think that in hindsight is 2020, and hearing the testimonies of people in the position of eldership, we can say with certainty at this point that although they originally gave him a process of restoration and repentance, I don't think that's what was really in their hearts. I think that they wanted to push him out, and so Driscoll preemptively resigned, blah, 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 blah. But here's the deal. My point is that I think one of the reasons why he was pushed out of his church with disgruntled elders, men in the church, and also male members of the church is because Driscoll exasperated his spiritual sons. And this is how he exasperated his spiritual sons. On the one hand, he exhorted and charged, and at times even rebuked, and rightfully so, his spiritual sons, the men in Mars Hill, for basically saying, you need to be biblical men. You need to be providers. You need to be hard workers. You need to be thinking about your grandchildren's financial well-being, leaving an inheritance to your children's children. You need to work in such a way that your wives can be keepers at home. You need to not send your children to Caesar and then be shocked when they come back as Romans. Don't use public schools. You need to have get married younger so that you can have the wife of your youth and delight in her always, as the proverb says, and have children in your youth, like Psalm 127 says, so that when those children are of fighting age, you're still fighting yourself. You're still in the fray. They're not coming in merely to replace you, but they're coming alongside you, sitting in the city gates. All these are biblical things. So get married young, have children young, have more than just a couple children, have several children, a quiver full of children, train train them in the fear and admonition of the Lord, which includes their formal education, and not sending them into a secular pagan institute for that education. Ensure that your wife can be a keeper at home, so you're not relying on her for a second income, and you're also being generous and giving to the church, and you're storing up an inheritance which is first and foremost spiritual, but it's not less than that, but it is more than that. It also contains a financial aspect of that inheritance, not just for your children, but your children's children. AKA, you add it all up, and what does it amount to? It amounts to a very tall order for financial provision. And here's the problem. All that is thoroughly biblical. Here's what's not biblical. And you also must be on mission and live in Seattle. You have to be on mission. It has to be Seattle. This is the place. This is the move of God. This is what he's doing. The old revivals in America, they started on the East Coast, and we have the institutions and the seminaries, and all these kinds of things on the East Coast, because that's where the gospel first hit, and that's where these works of God, and they came down to the South, and we have works of God, but the Pacific Northwest, was never really touched, and it's pagan for a reason. We've got to reach the lost here, and blah, blah, blah. And there's truth in that. I'm not saying that that's false. But here's the problem. The problem is when you are speaking out of both sides of your mouth and your two messages are directly contradicting one another. That is a recipe for exasperating your son. Exasperating, in Driscoll's case, as a spiritual father, as an elder, and the lead pastor of Mars Hill, exasperating your spiritual sons. Exasperating the men who are members in your church and the men who are elders in your church. Driscoll exasperated his sons because he said, you need to be men, manly men, masculine men, hardworking, financially providing men, traditional conservative men. But you need to do it in many ways in a very novel economy. Right? I'll just say this. I believe all the biblical tenets that I've already argued in terms of women working at home, having kids in your youth, having more than just 1.6 kids, not using public schools, not relying on your wife for a second income. I believe all these things, giving to the church, storing up an inheritance for your children's children. I would add to that also caring for your parents as they age, right? That's 1 Timothy 5. Children should learn to give some return to their parents, for this is good and pleasing in the sight of God. That primarily deals with widows, the children of widows, but I think it also has a broader application to caring for your aging parents, even if your father and mother are both still alive. So there's all these biblical commands to men in terms of protection, but what I'm focusing on right now is primarily provision. So God calls men to be a certain way and to do a certain thing, all within the realm of provision, and not just this spiritual, ethereal, theoretic provision, but tangible, material, physical provision. And it is never, I would argue, it has never been more difficult, more challenging to provide physically on one income with a household than it is right now. And then it has been for the last, 20, 30, 40 years. And a big part of that is because of feminism. Feminism sought to liberate women from the shackles of womanhood, domestic womanhood in the home and as mothers and housemakers, and what feminism ultimately did was it liberated women from the home, but then what it immediately did was it shackled them to corporate America, to where now you have all these women who want to come back home. They're realizing that this doesn't actually satisfy. They thought, I am woman, hear me roar, and I'm going to have a career, and I'm Miss Independent, and all this kind of, you saw this in our culture. And now women are waking up to it and they want to go back home, but they can't. They can't, because our economy has been reformatted off of the feminist movement, women getting away from the home and joining the marketplace. Joining corporate America, and now employers, they don't think, our economy is not structured in such a way that we think this man, whatever we pay him, his wages need to be able to support a wife and kids. That's just not the way we think anymore. We think, we think of, instead of households, right, and family units making up the bedrock of America, we think in an individualistic, isolated atoms. We think in that framework. So we think, I need to pay this person a livable wage for them, not for a family, right? So women need to work to provide for themselves. Men need to work to provide for themselves. And if they have kids, they need to, right? Even with Build Back Better agenda and all that, what were some of the key makeups of the bill, right? Well, a big part of what the Biden administration has been pushing is, let's extend the amount of time that children are not in the home, that they're being cared for by the state, right? So let's send children to school, to the state, at 3 years old instead of 5. 2 years leading up before preschool, right? With child care services that are built into taxation that don't cost money. And then let's also extend it on the back end, right? Kids go to school from, instead of K through 12, now it's going to be, 2-3 years before they even get to kindergarten. By the time they're 3 years old, they're already away from mom and dad, being cared for by the state. And then when they finish, 12th grade, they have to go to college, and then, oh, that's not enough. They have to get a master's degree. Oh, that's not enough. They need to get a doctorate degree. And so what we've done on both ends is we've just widened education. But really what we're doing is we're basically saying, we're separating, we're dividing children from their parents. We've basically said that children's time being nourished and admonished and instructed by their parents should be mitigated. It should be minimized. Children ultimately are not, they don't belong to the family. They don't belong to their parents. They are not assets of the parent. They're assets of the state. They belong to us. And so we need to get them to us as soon as possible, and we need to keep them with us as long as possible. And that's the way our culture and our higher education and our education system and our economy has been hardwired, and a lot of that came out of second wave and third wave feminist movement, right? Women getting out of the home, no longer keepers at home, because that was bondage and that was demeaning. And so they're liberated. But now women want to get back, and they realize, no, now we're actually slaves to another master, no longer slaves to our husbands, a man, the man that we married and made vows to, but slaves to the man, namely the corporate man, corporate America. We have to work. We no longer, we thought that we could go back. It was just a matter of what we wanted. But now we realize it's not a matter of what we want. It's a matter of what we're actually even capable of doing. We are, most households, it is nearly impossible now in our nation. And again, I blame feminism. There are other factors, but that is a major one. It is nearly impossible to provide for a family and do everything that the Bible calls men to do on a single income, because we have been rocked by feminism. So that's hard to do. Here's my point. That's hard to do no matter where you live in America, whether you're in Oklahoma or Kansas. But it is, I think we're fooling ourselves. We're being delusional and willfully ignorant if we don't acknowledge the blatantly obvious principle that although, because of the change in the makeup of our culture and education and economy due to feminism across the board anywhere in America, that's true. But if we don't recognize that there are varying degrees of difficulty based off of specifically geographically where you're at in America, if we don't acknowledge that, we're kidding ourselves. It is much harder to be a single income family with multiple children and not utilizing public schools and having the wife primarily work at home with the children and building wealth to leave an inheritance for your children's children, and being generous to the church, and I haven't mentioned this yet, and paying taxes. Paying your taxes. It's much harder to do that in Seattle than it is to do it in Kansas City. That's a reality. It's much harder to do that in California than it is to do it in Idaho. Period. And you might say, oh, but wages are higher and no. There are some places where wages are higher in certain blue states where the cost of living is higher. Taxation is higher, real estate is higher, and the wages are higher also. But proportionally, the wages are not following the cost of living. The cost of living goes way up and the wages go partially up, right? So I come from San Diego. I was there for 10 years. You guys, some of you have heard me talk about that, but San Diego was just, again, this is San Diego's been, poor San Diego. It's been rated this multiple times, but just recently, again, about 2-3 months ago, another study came out rating once again San Diego as the number one worst city in America to live in and build wealth. In terms of what? The cost of living when compared with the average median household income, jobs. So there are places in blue states, primarily progressive liberal policies, where these policies make the cost of living outrageous, but the job market has not kept pace. And so, yes, you will make more in Washington state than you will in Oklahoma. But the question is, do I make enough more? Do I have enough of an increase in my income in Washington state, given the increase in the cost of living? And I would say that the increase in cost of living versus the increase in wages is disproportional. Way more cost of living and somewhat more wages. And so here's the point. Mark Driscoll exasperated his spiritual sons. Mark Driscoll, what attracted people to him was he rose up, right? He wasn't doing ministry in a vacuum. None of us are, right? God put him in a specific, in God's providence and sovereignty, Driscoll was in a specific place and a specific time, right? He was doing ministry in a context, not in a vacuum. And the larger, broader context was the context of feminism and the feminization of the American evangelical church. And so Driscoll came as a sight for sore eyes. He came to men, especially young men like myself. He came on the scene as a phenomenon that men were attracted to for a reason, right? We were so sick of the Jesus is my boyfriend 20-minute TED Talk. We were so sick of that. That when Driscoll came with, big wooden pulpit and the design of the church and everything is masculine, church is for men. And he talked about, about battles and spiritual warfare. And there's a reason why his ministry exploded. There are multiple reasons, but that's one of them. And I'm arguing that was good. That, I think, was biblical. That Driscoll actually did have, I think, there are some flaws, but by and large, Driscoll had a much more faithful biblical view of men and women than most churches in America at the time. And I think that's one of the key reasons for his success. He attracted men, and Driscoll knew if I can get the men, I'll get the women and the children also. If you get the women and the children, you don't get the men. And the American evangelical church has seen that. We have churches filled with women and children, but the men stay home. But if you get the men, the women and children come with the men. So the men may not come with their wives, but the wives will come at a much higher proportion. Wives will come with their husbands far more often to church than a husband will come with his wife. So Driscoll knew if I get the men, then I'm going to get the household, the whole household. And that is a biblical principle. That's right. That's not just practical and strategic. That's biblical. That's patriarchy, right? That God works through fathers. And Driscoll understood that, and he was right. And that attracted a ton of men. But here's the problem. Over time, so people were attracted to this idea of I can be a warrior, I can be a man, I can be a provider, I can raise multiple children, and I can love my wife as Christ loved the church, and I can do this and do that and raise my children in the fear and admonition of the Lord, and those children are going to fight alongside me, in the fray and be like arrows and sit with me in the gates. And like that is a glorious vision for households that attracted men. But he's speaking out of both sides of his mouth. So in the very same breath, he would say all that is biblical and true and attractive to men, but then the very next sentence, he would say, we've got to be in Seattle. We've got to be in the Pacific Northwest. We've got to plant churches in the most liberal pagan places, the places where Christianity has had the least historical influence, aka the places that are blue states, blue cities with progressive liberal policies, high taxation, high cost of living, enormous cost to buy a home, cost of groceries, with very few school options outside of the public school, where it is virtually impossible, right? So Driscoll would always joke about how Seattle has, there are more dogs than children. Okay, yeah, that's funny. Really, that's sad. But here's a question, Driscoll. Did you ever think about why? And obviously he did, but I think he tied it completely to pagan theology. But what he didn't recognize, or if he recognized it, he didn't do a good job in compassion explaining it to the men in his church. The reason why there's more dogs in Seattle than children is, yes, because you have pagans who don't value children, but because you have pagans who don't value children, you have built a structure, an infrastructure in the city of Seattle, from the economy to the culture to all these things, to households where children are nearly impossible to provide for in Seattle. So you have more dogs than children because people value dogs more than children, but people who value dogs more than children over decades eventually create an infrastructure where having children is very difficult. And financially, it is nearly impossible. So my whole point is this. I teach the very same things that Driscoll did in terms of biblical masculinity, in terms of provision. Have kids, have a lot, have them young. Seek to allow your wife to work at home, at least primarily. Maybe there's some supplemental income, but primarily her work is at home with the children. And don't use public schools, and build wealth to leave an inheritance for not just your children, but your grandchildren. Care for your aging parents as they have needs, and give to the church. All these things, which they are all clear biblical commands to men, but all with practically, they all have financial implications. So these are commands from Christ, but we're fooling ourselves if we don't see the fact that they have real financial applications. Well, all these things cost money, is my point. If I'm going to be a biblical man, again, there are extenuating circumstances, but here's the deal. We make the exception the norm. So somebody who's saying, well, what about a man who was hit by a car and now he's a quadriplegic? Okay, that's not who I'm talking to. And we can't make the exception the norm. We need to go back to first principles. There are exceptions, sure, and I can do another video another time talking about those exceptions, but that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about young, healthy men who profess to be followers of Christ. What does the Bible say for them? It says that they should be protectors and providers, that they should lead households, and all of this has financial implications. And because it has financial implications, it matters where you live. So to say, I'm going to preach biblical masculinity, which requires a ton of work and a ton of cash, but at the same time, I'm also going to preach this missionary mentality where you can't quit the mission, you can't retreat, no compromise, no surrender. It's got to be in Seattle. Driscoll. Here's another thing. You'll remember this. Some of you will remember this. He used to make fun. He would use the word pagan. You remember this? He would say pagan literally means one on the farm. And he would talk about the insignificance of doing ministry and church planting in rural context. You remember that? See, people are forgetting with the rise and fall of Mars Hill and trying to do the autopsy and why it died. I think they're forgetting this major component. You have a man who is all about biblical masculinity and provision, financial provision, but also regularly insulted Christians who lived in rural areas. And what's the thing? What's the key factor about rural areas? It's easier to provide. There's a lower cost of living. There's less taxation, right? The further, even within a blue state, a liberal progressive state, the further you get away from major cities, the lower taxes are. There's less taxation. There's certainly less property taxes the further you get away from big cities. So if you're in a red state versus a blue state, you're going to have less financial obligation, right? There's a reason everybody's leaving California right now. There's a reason why Elon Musk lives outside of Austin, where I live, in Texas. Because there are far less regulations in Texas for starting a business. Now, I'm not saying live in Austin. Austin has an exorbitantly high cost of living also. But there's something strategic about where I live, which is not in Austin, but it's outside of Travis County. That's where Austin City is. But outside of that, in Williamson County, where I can hop on a toll road and within 35 minutes, I can be in Austin. So I have all the ministry opportunity, but also all the economic opportunity of the big city of Austin. But I also have some of the financial safeties and political safeties of the general larger state of Texas. So I have Austin opportunity, but Texas safety, right? Jim Wilson, Doug's dad, called the decisive point, right? My vicinity to Austin makes where I live significant, but my distance from Austin, being in a smaller town in a separate county within a larger, more conservative state of Texas, makes it winnable. So it's significant if it could be win because of the vicinity to Austin, but it's winnable because I'm outside of Austin and I'm in Texas. Right? But Driscoll wasn't thinking like that. He was only thinking in terms, he wasn't thinking about what's winnable, what's doable. He wasn't thinking about securities and safeties for those who have conservative values and want to live according to the Christian worldview. He was only exclusively thinking in terms of not what's winnable, but what it would be significant if it could be won. So he was only thinking in terms of significance, but not thinking in terms of doability. I'll say that again. He was thinking in terms of significance exclusively, but not in terms of doability. So he's saying, and he was also biblical, and I got to give him credit for that. I will always be grateful for Driscoll in the ways that he was biblically sound, and I think his view of men and women was one of that. Again, for those who are just tuning in, there are definitive statements he made that were inappropriate, that were sinful, that were crude. I'm not validating or affirming those things, but I'm saying his general theology about the design and the role between men and women, I think was, for the most part, generally biblical. But to have that view, a conservative, traditional biblical view of households and men and women and single income households, where the wife is primarily working in the home, and the husband is primarily working out of the home, but then to couple that with a ministry strategy in terms of geography, where we're going to be located, that is only concerned about significance and not concerned about places that have certain securities and safeties, what that does is it is a recipe for a spiritual father exasperating his spiritual sons. And I can tell you, from personal face-to-face conversations, because I used to be an Acts 29 pastor, and I still have multiple guys who were pastors in Acts 29, or they went to Acts 29 churches, or I personally pastored several people when I was in San Diego who used to be members in Seattle at Mars Hill when Driscoll was there, and all of them had the same testimony. And the testimony was, we went to Seattle and joined Mars Hill. We were initially attracted to Mark because he called men to something great. But then we eventually became disenchanted and actually angry even towards Mark because he was absolutely requiring, with no compassion and with no exceptions, no caveats, no disclaimers. He held as a strong rule that we all had to meet this vision of traditional conservative biblical masculinity, but we had to do it in one of the most difficult places. So we had to be faithful and traditional on the one hand, but then cutting edge and strategic in terms of our philosophy of ministry on the other hand, right? So our theology of ministry had to be conservative and traditional, but we had to do it in a context that was cutting edge and worked against the traditional makeup of the family. And I think that is one of the, not the only, but one of the biggest factors for the rise and fall of Mars Hill that most people do not talk about. They talk about the celebrity mentality. They talk about Driscoll's desire for fame and glory. All those things are true. They talk about the fact that he franchised the model out to multiple campuses. So, and that's a huge factor also. So you have 47 elders, right? And the majority of these elders are guys who are in different places, different campuses, some of them even in different cities, different states, right? They had a campus in Orange County all the way down in Southern California. And so you have all these elders that you don't actually have close relationship with, right? So that was a factor also. And not only do you not have close relationship with your elders because you've franchised and extended the brand, the empire, so you've spread it so thin that you don't have relationship with these elders. So that there's likely, there's a higher likelihood for a mutiny, for betrayal. But not only that, but you are enticing them to betray you. Why? Because you are taking from these men, you're appointing them as pastors and then taking from them one of the chief desires that a pastor has. You know what that is? Preaching. So what would Driscoll do? He would appoint pastors who, Driscoll's not there. He's not in Orange County. He doesn't know the sheep there. He doesn't know the congregation, right? He appoints some man who he's the one who's doing all the marriage counseling. He's the one who's with this couple that just had a miscarriage and counseling them through grief. He's the one who's actually shepherding the sheep with the flock. He knows what's actually going on. But then Sunday morning happens, and in pipes in Driscoll on a screen preaching. And this man has to sit down on the front row and listen to another man preach to his flock. I think, again, we are being delusional. We're kidding ourselves if we don't think that was enticing some of these elders to have a frustration towards Driscoll. That was another example of Driscoll exasperating his spiritual sons. So you have, you spread it too thin with the brand, you're piping in your teaching, and so you're stealing from elders. So they have this plurality elder model. So who has the power to remove Driscoll? The elders. And who are the people that you are angering and exasperating the most? The elders. Why? Because you're giving them the responsibility of shepherding the sheep, but you're taking from them their greatest weapon of shepherding the sheep, their greatest ability for accomplishing that responsibility, namely the pulpit. Right? It would be like appointing a police officer and saying, your responsibility is to protect and serve, but you will not be given a badge or a gun. Right? God always teams up rights and responsibilities together. Right? You have a certain responsibility, a certain duty, but then God also grants to that person who he gives responsibility and duty to, he gives them the corresponding rights and privileges in order to carry out that responsibility. So if you're called as a police officer to protect and serve the public, you also are granted the corresponding rights of a badge and a gun in order to carry out that responsibility. Well, one of the rights that a pastor is given in order to carry out his responsibility of shepherding the flock of God among him is the pulpit, is the Lord's Day preaching of the pastor. And so when you charge men with the responsibility of shepherding the sheep, and they're actually on the ground and they actually know what's happening with the sheep, but you rob from them the pulpit, the means of shepherding, one of the chief means of shepherding the sheep, that is a recipe for exasperating your spiritual sons. And then you couple that with your ecclesiology and your plurality of elders and the fact that the people, the specific people who have the authority to fire you, Mr. Driscoll, are these men that you're robbing their ability to preach, then don't be surprised if all of a sudden you have a mutiny on your hands. So you've got that going on. And then you also have at the church level, not just the elders, but the men in the church in general, attracting them with a glorious vision for biblical masculinity, but then insisting that this vision for biblical masculinity must be carried out in some of the most demonic context in cities that hate masculinity and have restructured and rehardwired their entire culture and economic system to work against biblical masculinity, to where it is nearly impossible to be a single income provider in a place like San Francisco, Seattle, DC. And right now, I'll end with this. Right now, what we see, how is this relevant for us today? I think that's what happened with Mars Hill, okay? But how is this relevant for us today? This is what we're seeing. I keep hitting my pulpit, but this is what we're seeing again and again and again. For the last, we've seen this for 10 years, 20 years, but it has ramped up exponentially, times 100 in the last 2 years. What we're seeing is a massive polarization in our nation. And we're not just seeing a polarization in terms of people's political and cultural views, their opinions, their convictions, but we are seeing people's political, cultural, moral, religious views also function as a sorting hat in the geographical region in which they live. You've got conservatives leaving California. So people say, oh, you're going to turn Texas blue. No, Texas is purple. Way, way, way more purple than I want it to be. But you know why? It's not primarily because people are leaving California and moving to Texas. The people leaving California, they've done studies on this in polls. Most of the people leaving California are conservatives. They are leaving California because of its liberal policies, and they actually have connected the dots. They recognize California is impossible to live in because of those policies. So they're not coming to Texas and saying Texas is great if only they would vote Democrat. No. They've learned that lesson the hard way. The people who are turning Texas purple and potentially blue are not the people coming from blue states, right? The transplants into Texas. It's all the kids who grew up in Texas who are now of voting age because their parents did not distill in them the same values and virtues that the parents had. And one of the reasons that the parents failed in that is they sent them to public school. So what's turning Texas purple and potentially blue, I don't think it's going to go there, at least not anytime soon, but what's turning Texas purple is not people coming in from California. It's kids who are raised in Texas but in public school with state indoctrination. And the left, the political left, has a monopoly on the institution of education, even in red states. All right. So all that being said, we have a mass polarization. And what we have happening right now is we basically have everybody recognizing, to put it in a nutshell, we have a ton of conservatives and a ton of Christian conservatives recognizing precisely what Driscoll did not recognize. That Driscoll had half of the puzzle right. Driscoll was right about this glorious vision of biblical masculinity and returning to a traditional conservative biblical view of the household and the roles between men and women and a biblical, faithful view of children. Driscoll had that right. And we have more and more people adopting that. But then we have people also adopting the other side of the coin that Driscoll missed, which is ministry in red states and rural areas, not always just in the blue state, Washington State, California, New York. No, but ministry in red states and in rural areas is meaningful. It's meaningful because there is significance, but there's also winnability, right? Manhattan would be significant if we could take it, but we can't. Not yet. We will. I believe that we will. I'm very optimistic in my eschatology. But I think the first step, right? So how do we win California? Well, what about, California needs churches. We need people. How do we win California? I think one of the ways that we win California, I think there's a false dichotomy between fighting and fleeing. Well, I wrote a book that I haven't published yet, but Doug Wilson actually wrote the foreword for it, and I've had some guys endorse it, and it may be coming out sometime in the future. We'll see. But the title of the book is this: Fight by Flight. Not fight or flight, reflex, but fight by flight. I believe one of the best ways that Christians and conservatives can fight against the insane liberal progressive policies in places like California is by leaving California. Right? Think of the prodigal son, right? The prodigal son, he leaves the house, he spends his whole inheritance. He's in a far off distant land. A famine hits the land. He's feeding pigs, and he longs to be filled to eat the pods, the pig food, right? And the scripture says something very, very profound. It says this: and no one gave him anything. He's hungry, and nobody comes and gives him a handout. Nobody helps him out. And so then what happens? And then he came to his senses. I believe that one of the ways Christians and conservatives can help foolish, idiotic, progressive liberals come to their senses is by not giving them anything. And the reality is, you may say, well, I'm staying here in Seattle to fight. Well, here's the question. Are you fighting more than you're funding? And I would argue probably not. Not in every case. Again, there are exceptions, but I'm speaking about first principles. I'm speaking in generalities. I'm speaking big picture, 30,000-foot view. In most cases, many people who are all about the mission, right? The mission for California, the mission for Washington State, the mission in New York, that kind of mentality. I think these people have good intentions, but in reality, when it comes to their time, their talent, and their treasure, their resources, more of it is funding the thing that they're claiming to fight against than actually fighting it, right? So if you want to be, this is an exercise that'll probably hurt your pride a bit. It'll be painful, but go ahead and just pull up your bank statements. How much did you pay in state taxes, California Christian, the last year, 2021, and how much did you give to your local church? And just do some simple math. How much are you supporting public schools in California? Right? So then you can break down. And what do your state taxes go towards? How much money did you give to Planned Parenthood? Not because you wanted to, but by simply virtue of choosing to stay there. How much did you fund Planned Parenthood? And then, if you really want to take a cold, hard look in the mirror. How much does Planned Parenthood, how much does it cost them in terms of revenue in order to commit one abortion? So how much did you give in state taxes? How much of that went to Planned Parenthood? And you can really get down to dollars and cents. How many babies did I fund their murder? And then look over here and say, and how much did I give to the local church? And what did my local church do to fight back? And then really ask yourself, honestly, am I funding more than fighting? Or is California like the prodigal son? The best way it could come to its senses is if no one gave him anything. And my presence here, even though I say it's fighting, I'm actually funding, I'm actually giving the prodigal son, right? When he's at the end of his rope, when he's made his foolish decisions and his foolish policies and spent all of his inheritance and has nothing, and he's hungry, and God intends for that shame and that hunger and that poverty to drive him to repentance, to drive him to Christ, and yet I'm working actually as a barrier between this rebellious, wayward son and him coming back to the Father. I'm actually standing in the way of him by giving him a handout, by simply my presence, choosing to stay in a place like Seattle, and my funding, because my funding is actually doing more harm than my fighting. So for me, that's a false dichotomy, fight or flight. No, it's fight by flight. It's fighting by fleeing. I legitimately believe that one of the best things that we can do to win California, to win. So all that being said, Driscoll's right. We need to win Seattle. And I think the way we do it is we let Seattle implode on itself by pulling the salt of the earth out and making the progressive, stupid liberals have a taste of their own medicine without getting the bailouts of the hard-working, salt of the earth Christians and conservatives who are paying for all their idiot policies. I think that's how we win. And what we have happening right now is people waking up to that. And some of you don't like that, but let me just say, you're on the wrong side of history. And I mean this as loving as possible. And you'll bring up John MacArthur. John MacArthur's in California. Listen, there is a dynamic difference between where a man chooses to end his life and where a man chooses to begin it. So you're comparing John MacArthur and say, well, John MacArthur's here, so I should be here. Okay, but my first question would be this. Are you a 35-year-old man right now talking? Because John MacArthur is 83. John MacArthur has been doing faithful ministry in Southern California for over 50 years, like 52 years, which means when John MacArthur was making the decision of where he was going to start a household, raise a family, and do pastoral ministry, when John MacArthur was making these decisions, it was not the California of today. John MacArthur was making these decisions, I believe, if my math is right, it would have been 1969. 1969. So John MacArthur's decision is not the same as your decision. You're making the decision of where to raise a household, where to plant a church, where to start a business, where to build wealth, where to usher in this glorious new Christendom. You're making that decision in 2022, not 1969. And so for MacArthur to stay in the last few years of his life, he's not going to live that much longer. So for MacArthur to stay to determine where he's going to end his life is vitally different, dynamically different than you deciding as a young man where you're going to start your life, where you're going to raise your kids, right? John MacArthur is saying, I want to die with my grandchildren who are already grown, not just his kids, his grandchildren are older, right? But your grandchildren don't even exist. You haven't even finished having the first generation of your children, right? So I'm talking to the 30-something-year-old man who has one or two kids or no kids and just got married and is talking about, where am I going to start a business? Where am I going to put down roots? Where am I going to buy my first home? Where am I going to plant a church? Where am I going to take a wife? Where are we going to have children? Who are my grandchildren going to marry? Where are they going to be raised? That question is radically different than John MacArthur's question of, where am I going to finish the race the last few years? It's just radically different. So for everybody who would want to use John MacArthur as a counter argument to the general first principles that I'm providing now, I would just say it doesn't work. It doesn't work. So all that being said, why did Mark Driscoll fail? A host of reasons. And a lot of the reasons you've heard before, but I think this is one that maybe you haven't heard. One of the chief reasons that Mark Driscoll and Mars Hill imploded and failed was because he held to a biblical view of manhood, which has financial implications, but then he held to this pie in the sky philosophy of ministry in terms of the missionary mentality that it has to be significant. And the only places that are significant are big cities and blue states. And these two things work against each other. Traditional conservative view of the family and manhood, and must be a missionary in a big city in a blue state. These things go against each other. Mark Driscoll was always saying, men work hard. And then in the very next breath, pagan means one who works on the farm. People in rural cities are insignificant and stupid. Yeah, that was a recipe for exasperating your sons. Men were attracted to you, Mark, because you were preaching the right things about manhood. But then they were angered by you because you insisted that they did biblical manhood in a place that is nearly impossible to do it. And well, what about Seattle? Seattle needs churches. Yeah, and we can kill two birds with one stone. Let's get Christian conservative men out of Seattle where they can actually do manhood. Let Seattle, like the prodigal son, not be given any more handouts by the salt of the earth that actually pays for its stupid policies. Let them get a taste of their own medicine. They'll implode. And then when we think generationally, we'll send our children and grandchildren back in to take over the land. Maybe it's that simple. Why can't people get this? Thanks for tuning in.